What do you do when your husband of 30 years locks you out of your own anniversary party, hands your ticket to his mistress, and tells you to go home? Most women would cry. Most women would scream. But Clara didn't shed a single tear. She just turned around and walked away in total silence. Because what her arrogant husband didn't realize was that the quiet wife he just humiliated secretly owned the very ground he was standing on. Stick around until the very end to see exactly how she dismantles his entire life. Before we dive into the details, please take a quick second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, drop a comment letting me know where in the world you are watching from. I absolutely love seeing where all my viewers are located. Now, let's get back to the story. Pay close attention to what happens when the floor falls out from under you. Most people scream. Most people beg. But some women, the truly dangerous ones, just go perfectly, completely still. Look at the woman standing on the pavement. Her name is Clara. She is 58 years old, wearing a modest, dark wool coat that swallows the evening chill. She is standing outside the soaring glass doors of the Lumina Estate, the most exclusive, hyper-luxury development this city has ever seen. Inside those doors, champagne is flowing. Flashbulbs are popping. Tonight is the estate's grand opening, a crown jewel in the empire of a flashy real estate tycoon named Richard. Tonight is also Clara's 30th wedding anniversary to that very man. But Clara hasn't come for the champagne. She hasn't come for the applause. If you look closely, you will see how tightly she is clutching her purse against her chest. Inside that purse is a small, heavy velvet box. It holds the ashes of her older sister, who took her final breath just 4 hours ago in a quiet hospice room. Clara sat by that bed alone. She watched the life leave her sister's eyes alone. She is carrying a grief so fresh and so absolute that it feels like a physical, crushing weight against her ribs. She came to these glittering doors because, after 30 years of marriage, a woman assumes her husband will hold her when her world ends. Watch closely, because this is where the breaking happens. As Clara reaches the velvet ropes of the VIP entrance, the glass doors slide open. Richard steps out into the crisp night air. But he is not alone, and he is not reaching for his wife. To his left stands his younger sister, Eleanor, a woman who has spent 3 decades looking at Clara like dirt tracked onto a white rug. To his right stands a woman Clara has never seen before. She is young. She is stunning. She is draped in silk and a quiet, lethal confidence. Her name is Vanessa. Clara looks at her husband, her eyes glassy, her voice barely a whisper, waiting for the comfort he owes her. Instead, Richard looks at the dark wool coat. He looks at her exhausted, tear-stained face, and he sighs. It isn't a sigh of pity. It is a sigh of sheer inconvenience. Without a single word of sorrow for the sister she just buried, Richard reaches out and slides his fingers over the VIP lanyard resting in Clara's hand. He pulls it from her grip. He turns to the younger woman and drops the lanyard perfectly around Vanessa's neck. "You shouldn't be here, Clara," Richard says, his voice smooth and entirely empty. "Look at you. You don't fit the aesthetic of the evening. We have investors. We have cameras. Take a cab back home. The kitchen is much more your speed tonight." Eleanor laughs, a sharp, cruel sound that cuts through the street noise. Vanessa just touches the VIP pass resting on her collarbone and smiles a slow, satisfied smile, as if she has just won a prize. What do you do in that exact second? With the love of your life standing beside his mistress, barring you from your own anniversary, while you carry the literal ashes of your family, you would forgive a woman for falling to her knees. You would forgive her for shattering right there on the concrete. But Clara does not shatter. She does not let a single tear fall. The grief that was drowning her just moments ago instantly crystallizes into something cold, hard, and terrifyingly clear. She slips her empty hand into the deep pocket of her wool coat. Her fingers find a small, tarnished skeleton key. She grips the cold metal, letting the sharp edges bite into her palm. She looks at her husband, at his sneering sister, at the mistress wearing her pass. She doesn't say a single word. She just turns her back to the glittering glass doors and walks away into the dark. They think they have just discarded a weak, irrelevant woman. They have no idea they just activated an earthquake. To understand what happened at those glass doors, you have to understand the man standing on the other side of them. It is dangerously easy to write Richard off as a simple monster, but monsters are born out of malice. Richard was born out of panic. Men do not become that deliberately cruel because they are powerful. They become that cruel because they are drowning, frantically pushing others under the water just to catch a single breath of air. For 30 years, Richard had constructed an absolute masterpiece of smoke and mirrors. He was a man addicted to the intoxicating drug of high society, desperately craving the envy of lesser men and the applause of strangers. But if you stripped away the bravado, almost nothing he flaunted actually belonged to him. The imported sports cars parked out front were leased on terrible terms. The sprawling, minimalist penthouse he called home was mortgaged to the very hilt. Every bespoke Italian suit, every lavish European vacation, every vintage bottle of champagne was paid for by a dizzying web of high-interest loans and heavily leveraged assets. He had built a towering fortress on a foundation of quicksand, and he spent every waking hour terrified that someone would notice the walls sinking. And then there was Clara. When they were young and had nothing, her quiet practicality had been the anchor that kept him safe. But as his appetite for the illusion grew, that anchor started to feel like a heavy chain. Clara never asked for diamonds. She never cared about having her name printed in the Sunday Society pages. She just wanted the man she married. But to a man living a frantic delusion, a grounded woman is a terrifying threat. Her quiet steadiness, her careful budgeting, her utter lack of pretense. It all became a mirror he couldn't stand to look into. It reflected his own reckless, hollow insecurities right back at him. He didn't just fall out of love with his wife. He learned to deeply resent her. He convinced himself he had outgrown her, because every time her calm eyes met his, she reminded him of the pathetic truth he was trying so desperately to outrun. His sister, Eleanor, only fed this poison, constantly whispering that Clara was dead weight, keeping him from his true potential. Which brings us to the Lumina estate. The flashing cameras outside painted this glittering tower as the crowning achievement of a visionary real estate titan. The reality was a financial death warrant. Richard had leveraged everything he had left, his name, his remaining commercial properties, his very soul, to fund this single, colossal development, and he was entirely out of time. The secret he kept from Vanessa, from Eleanor, from the journalist drinking his free liquor, was a staggering, suffocating mountain of debt. Tonight wasn't a celebration. It was a desperate final gamble. Richard was waiting for the representatives of a massive, completely anonymous private equity firm to walk through those doors. They were scheduled to sign a massive bailout tonight, a quiet acquisition that would swallow his debts and leave him incredibly wealthy. If that ink didn't dry before midnight, the illusion would completely shatter. By tomorrow morning, the banks would seize the estate, the cars, the penthouse. He would face total bankruptcy, publicly and violently. He stood in that ballroom, sipping expensive champagne, his arm wrapped around his beautiful young mistress, genuinely believing he had just discarded the heaviest burden in his life at the curb. He thought he was minutes away from becoming an untouchable king. He had no idea his kingdom was already reduced to ashes. When a woman walks away from her own destruction without a single sound, you have to ask yourself what she knows that the rest of the world doesn't. To understand the chilling silence of Clara, you have to look far past the glittering towers of her husband's world and go back to a dusty, quiet workshop smelling of brass and oil. Clara was raised by a humble man, a master locksmith and property caretaker, who spent his life quietly maintaining the grand estates of the old rich. He wasn't a man of wealth, but he was a man of profound observation. He watched arrogant men panic over lost keys, broken deadbolts, and locked vaults. He saw how quickly their power vanished when they were shut out of their own rooms. One afternoon, he pressed a heavy, tarnished skeleton key into young Clara's palm. He closed her fingers around the cold metal and told her something she would never forget. He said, "Let them make their noise. Let them rattle the locks and beg to be let in. True power doesn't need to rattle the locks. Clara, true power owns the doors." When Richard began his descent into the frantic, flashy illusion of high society, Clara remembered the workshop. She watched her husband chase leased sports cars and empty applause, and she recognized the terrifying fragility of his ego. When her father passed away, he left her a very modest inheritance, a small, quiet sum of money. Richard had scoffed at it, calling it grocery money. entirely beneath his notice. So Clara simply agreed, and she put the money away. She didn't buy a designer wardrobe or a luxury sedan. She took that small seed and quietly purchased a distressed, forgotten parcel of industrial land on the desolate edge of the city. Then she bought another. While Richard was out shaking hands at galas and begging for high-interest loans, Clara was sitting at her kitchen table in the dead of night, studying zoning laws and municipal blueprints. She began acquiring undervalued logistics hubs, abandoned commercial districts, and failing private equity portfolios. To shield her work from her husband's ravenous pride, she folded everything into a faceless, profoundly boring corporate entity she named Iron and Oak. There were no flashy logos, no ribbon-cutting ceremonies, no press releases, just paper, land, and relentless, compounding equity. She never told him. She knew perfectly well that a drowning man doesn't admire a lifeboat. He strips it for parts. Richard's ego would have consumed her quiet empire in seconds just to feed his own illusion. Over 2 decades, an invisible chasm opened between them. While Richard frankly built a towering house of cards, Clara quietly built the wind. She didn't just become wealthy. She became an absolute titan, a phantom billionaire operating entirely in the shadows, moving markets without ever showing her face. And here's the most beautiful, poetic irony of it all. The luxury commercial districts Richard boasted about leasing, the institutional banks that held his suffocating high-interest loans, the very soil beneath the Lumina estate where he stood crowning his mistress. If you trace the paperwork through a dizzying maze of shell corporations and blind trusts, it all pointed back to one desk, Clara's desk. The discarded wife he had just sent home in a cab didn't just share his life. She owned the very earth he was standing on. Every tragedy has a catalyst, a single, quiet moment where the point of no return is crossed. For Clara, that moment didn't happen in the glaring lights of the Lumina estate. It happened on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday afternoon, 6 months ago, in the carpeted hallway of their own home. But first, you must understand the woman waiting on the other end of the telephone line. Vanessa was not a tragic victim of Richard's charm. She was a ruthless, calculating social climber who looked at the bespoke suits, the sweeping penthouse views, and the endless champagne, and saw a ladder she was determined to climb. She genuinely believed Richard was a billionaire titan of industry. She saw Clara as nothing more than pathetic, outdated obstacle, a woman who simply didn't know when to gracefully exit the stage. Vanessa fed Richard's fragile ego exactly what it hungered for, whispering that he was a king who deserved a queen to match his reflection. She didn't realize the ladder she was climbing was completely hollow, built over a terrifying abyss. On that Tuesday, Clara had been doing what she always did. She was carrying a silver tray with a warm cup of chamomile tea toward Richard's home office. The heavy wooden door was pushed open just a fraction of an inch, just enough to let his voice slip through. He was on the phone. Clara paused, not to eavesdrop, but because she heard a sound that had vanished from their marriage years ago. A warm, effortless, genuine laugh. She stood perfectly still in the corridor as Richard's voice dropped into a low, intimate register. She listened as her husband of 3 decades spoke to Vanessa. She listened as he promised the younger woman a weekend in Paris, as he mocked the modest clothes Clara wore, as he stripped away 30 years of quiet loyalty for cheap entertainment. And then he delivered the fatal blow. "Don't worry about Clara," Richard chuckled, the sound dripping with casual, breathtaking cruelty. "She's completely clueless. She's just a dusty old anchor holding the ship back. I'll cut the line soon enough." What do you do when the man you built your entire life around reduces your devotion to trash? A weaker woman would have dropped the silver tray. A louder woman would have kicked the door open, demanded answers, and screamed until her lungs bled. But remember who Clara is. Remember the daughter of the locksmith. Her hands did not tremble. The fine china cup on the silver tray did not even rattle. She stood in the hallway and let the words sink deep into her bones. She felt the raw, agonizing sting of a broken heart, but she did not let it shatter her. Instead, she let the pain freeze. In that shadowed corridor, Clara made a decision that would seal her husband's fate forever. She turned around and walked silently back to the kitchen. She poured the warm tea straight down the drain. She didn't hire a divorce attorney to wage a messy public war for half his fake empire. She decided to let him keep it. She decided to let him sail his magnificent ship straight into the hurricane. That very night, operating from the impenetrable shadows of iron and oak, Clara began a ruthless, forensic audit of her husband's existence. She deployed her wealth to trace every hidden loan, every toxic lease, every desperate financial gamble he had ever made. She mapped out exactly where his house of cards was most vulnerable. She didn't plot to push him off a cliff. She meticulously ensured that when his own arrogance finally caused him to lose his balance, there would be absolutely no net to catch him, and he would fall all the way to the jagged bottom. Let us return to the cold pavement outside the Lumina estate, back to the small, heavy velvet box resting inside Clara's purse. To understand the sheer gravity of what Richard did at those glass doors, you must fully grasp what that box represents. It wasn't just ashes. It was a lifetime of shared secrets, whispered childhood fears, and the very last piece of family Clara had left in the world. For 2 agonizing years, Clara's older sister had been fading in a sterile, fluorescent-lit hospice bed. And for 2 years, Clara had sat beside her, watching the strongest woman she ever knew be slowly and mercilessly dismantled by illness. That very morning, as the sun had barely begun to scrape the city skyline, the call came. It is a phone call you dread in the pit of your stomach, the one that changes the gravitational pull of your entire life. Clara drove through the empty morning streets, rushing into the quiet room just in time to hold her sister's fragile, paper-thin hand. She sat there as the medical monitors hummed their steady rhythm, tracing the familiar lines of her sister's face, listening as the breaths grew shallow and then inevitably stopped. The crushing, suffocating weight of that silence in the room is something you only truly know if you have lived it, a vital piece of your own history, suddenly gone forever. And where was Richard? He was standing in his expansive walk-in closet, admiring the cut of the bespoke tuxedo in a full-length mirror. Clara had called him from the desolate hallway of the hospice, her voice cracking, begging him to come to her. She needed him. After 30 years of marriage, this was the exact moment a vow is actually tested. But Richard had simply sighed into the receiver, that same chilling sigh of inconvenience. He told her he couldn't possibly manage the depressing optics of a hospital visit on the most important day of his career. The gala needed his undivided attention. He dismissed her devastation with a casual wave of his hand to the phone, telling her to handle the grim arrangements and pull herself together for the evening's photographs. Clara had handled the arrangements entirely alone. She walked out of the crematorium as the sun dipped below the horizon, carrying her sister's ashes against her chest. She was hollowed out, shivering in her wool coat, completely untethered from the world. She didn't drive to the Lumina estate to celebrate a grand opening, or even to fight for her 30th anniversary. She drove to those glittering doors because she was a woman drowning in grief, desperately searching for the one shore she thought she still had. She just wanted her husband of 3 decades to wrap his arms around her and tell her she wasn't entirely alone. Instead, she found the glass doors. She found Vanessa draped in silk. She found her 30th anniversary traded for a cheap VIP lanyard, and her profound grief treated as a pathetic blemish on the evening's aesthetic. A triple betrayal delivered with a smile, all in under 60 seconds. The man didn't just break a marriage vow. He looked at his wife on the darkest, most agonizing day of her life, and he stepped on her throat to make himself look taller to a stranger. When Clara turned her back and walked away into the night, the sorrow that had threatened to consume her evaporated. What took its place was not rage. Rage is loud, messy, and careless. What took its place was a burning, immaculate need for absolute justice. Richard had finally crossed the invisible line from which no man ever returns. Inside the grand ballroom of the Lumina estate, the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and desperate ambition. A string quartet played softly beneath a towering chandelier that cast a golden, flawless light over the city's elite. This was Richard's kingdom. He stood at the center of the raised mahogany stage, absolutely radiating the smug, intoxicating glow of a man who believes he has just cheated death. He held a crystal flute of champagne in one hand, raising it slightly to the sea of flashing cameras and admiring faces. To his right, Vanessa leaned into him, a vision in emerald silk, playing the part of the devoted muse to perfection. To his left, Eleanor practically vibrated with gloating triumph, looking over the crowd as if she owned them all. Richard leaned into the microphone, his voice dripping with practiced manufactured charm. He thanked the mayor. He thanked his investors. And then he lowered his voice, letting a conspiratorial smile spread across his face. He announced to the breathless room that tonight was not merely a grand opening. Tonight, the anonymous representatives of the legendary private equity firm, Iron Oak, were arriving to sign the final acquisitions. He spun the narrative brilliantly. He wasn't being bailed out of a catastrophic financial grave. He was entering a historic partnership that would make him an undisputed king of the city. The crowd erupted into applause. Richard closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him, entirely blind to the venomous reality coiled right beside him. Because while Richard was busy absorbing the adoration, Vanessa was looking down at a slim silver phone concealed behind her clutch. Her manicured fingers moved rapidly, sending a silent, encrypted message to Richard's fiercest rival developer. She had never planned on staying. She was simply waiting for the iron and oak ink to dry, planning to leverage Richard's newly secured assets to negotiate a far more lucrative position in a younger, richer man's bed. The tycoon who thought he had outsmarted everyone was standing on a stage entirely surrounded by traitors, oblivious of the fact that his hollow empire was already rotting from the inside out. But the true danger wasn't standing on the stage. The true danger was standing out in the cold. Down on the street level, hidden from the flashing lights in the valet line, Clara had not hailed a cab. She had not gone home to the kitchen. She stood in the freezing shadows of the courtyard, the dark wool of her morning coat absorbing the chill of the wind. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a simple phone. She dialed a single, private number. It rang only once before her chief legal officer answered. Clara did not explain her grief. She did not hesitate. She spoke a single, quiet sentence into the receiver, authorizing the immediate execution of a financial trap she had spent 6 months meticulously laying. She ended the call. She slipped the phone back into her pocket, her fingers brushing against the tarnished skeleton key and the heavy velvet box holding her sister's ashes. She smoothed the lapels of her dark coat, letting the quiet strength of her father's lessons settle deep into her posture. She looked up at the towering glass and steel monument her husband had traded her soul to build. And then, with the slow, deliberate steps of an incoming storm, Clara began to walk directly toward the massive, guarded double doors of the grand ballroom. The clock had finally run out. The applause inside the ballroom was a living, breathing thing, wrapping around Richard like a warm, intoxicating blanket. He leaned closer to the microphone, letting a triumphant, practiced smile spread across his face. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice boomed, echoing off the vaulted ceilings. The future of the Lumina estate is no longer merely a vision. It is a reality. Tonight, we solidify a partnership that will reshape the skyline of the city. Please, direct your attention to the rear doors and welcome the majority shareholder of Iron and Oak. The crowd turned as one, a sea of diamonds, tailored silk, and breathless anticipation. The heavy, carved oak doors at the back of the grand ballroom swung open with a deep, echoing thud. The string quartet, unsure of their cue, let their music falter and die into a nervous, suffocating silence. The crowd expected a phalanx of untouchable corporate titans. They expected ruthlessly polished men in expensive suits. Instead, stepping out of the shadows and into the blinding glare of the chandeliers, was a 58-year-old woman in a modest, dark wool coat. It was Clara. Her face was completely devoid of makeup. Her eyes were tired, carrying the weight of a funeral, but her posture was as straight and unbreakable as a steel rod. A collective murmur rippled through the room. On the stage, Richard's triumphant smile froze. For a fleeting second, pure panic flashed in his eyes, instantly replaced by a deep, condescending annoyance. He genuinely thought she had snapped. He thought his grieving, discarded wife had lost her mind and returned to make a humiliating public scene. Eleanor, standing behind him, let out an audible scoff, while Vanessa leaned away, embarrassed by the disruption. Clara, Richard said into microphone, his voice dripping with forced, patronizing patience, hoping to play it off to his investors. This is highly inappropriate. Security will escort you back to... But Richard stopped. The words died in his throat, because as Clara walked down the center aisle, the The crowd naturally parted for her, and Richard finally saw who was walking exactly one step behind her. She was not flanked by security. She was flanked by the apex predators of the city's financial ecosystem. To her left was the managing partner of the most ruthless corporate law firm in the state. To her right was the president of the very institutional bank currently holding Richard's most toxic, leveraged loans. 6 more executives, men and women whose mere presence could tank a stock price, followed in a tight, protective formation behind the woman in the morning coat. Richard's hand began to shake. The champagne in his crystal flute trembled, spilling over his knuckles. Clara stopped at the base of the stage. She didn't look angry. She looked at Richard the way one looks at a foolish child playing too near a fire. The managing partner of the law firm, a man Richard had spent 3 years desperately trying to get on the phone, walked up the stairs of the stage. He didn't look at Richard. He didn't acknowledge Vanessa or Eleanor. He simply walked to the microphone stand, detached the silver microphone, and turned back to the stairs. He walked down, stopped in front of Clara, and bowed his head in a gesture of profound, absolute deference. He handed her the microphone. "The room is yours, Madam Chairman," the lawyer said, his voice carrying through the dead silent ballroom, without the need for amplification. Madam Chairman. 2 words. 2 words that shattered a 30-year illusion into a million jagged pieces. The color completely drained from Richard's face. He stumbled back a half-step, his expensive leather shoe catching on the microphone wire. He bumped into Vanessa, who was staring at Clara in sheer, uncomprehending horror. The puzzle pieces suddenly snapped together in Richard's mind with sickening, violent clarity. The quiet nights she spent reading at the kitchen table. The modest inheritance she never touched. The absolute, chilling lack of fear when he locked her out in the cold. His discarded, irrelevant wife didn't just crash his party. She owned the debt. She owned the land. She owned the very stage he was standing on. Clara lifted the microphone. She did not tap it. She did not clear her throat to demand attention. When she finally spoke, her voice was not laced with hysterical rage or bitter vengeance. It was calm, measured, and entirely devastating. It was the voice of a woman who had spent 30 years watching a foolish man build a towering castle out of sand, and was now simply pointing out the rising tide. "Good evening," Clara said, her words rolling smoothly through the cavernous, breathless room. "My name is Clara. I am the founder and majority shareholder of Iron and Oak, and I am here to formally address the proposed acquisition of the Lumina estate, along with the assumption of the staggering, catastrophic debts currently held by its developer." She paused. The silence in the ballroom was so absolute you could hear the faint, electrical hum of the chandeliers. You could hear the frantic, shallow breathing of the man frozen on the stage. "For 6 months, my firm has conducted a forensic audit of this enterprise," Clara continued, her eyes finally locking onto Richard's pale, terrified face. "We have reviewed the leveraged loans. We have examined the toxic leases. We have looked far beneath the imported marble and the bespoke marketing, and we have concluded that there is nothing here of actual, sustainable value." Richard gripped the edges of the mahogany podium, his knuckles stark white. He opened his mouth to defend himself, to spin another lie, but only a pathetic, breathless wheeze escaped his throat. "Therefore," Clara said, her voice dropping a fraction of an octave, carrying the crushing finality of a judge's gavel, effective immediately, Iron and Oak formally declines the bailout. We do not invest in illusions, Richard, and we do not build on hollow foundations. The collapse of a man's entire universe is rarely a loud thing. It happens in the quiet, agonizing realization of the people standing next to him. Vanessa was the first to move. She possessed a razor-sharp, predatory instinct of a survivalist. As Clara's words hung in the heavy air, the brutal math calculated behind Vanessa's beautiful eyes. She looked at Richard, not with devotion, not even with pity, but with absolute, visceral disgust. The untouchable billionaire she had so ruthlessly attached herself to was a mirage. He was worse than broke. He was a walking financial crater. Without a single word, Vanessa physically stepped back, creating a wide, undeniable gap between herself and Richard on the stage. She dropped her hand from his arm as if his tailored jacket had suddenly caught fire. The ladder she had been climbing had just dissolved into ash beneath her feet. Eleanor, however, lacked Vanessa's cold intelligence. Blinded by 30 years of unwarranted arrogance, she lurched forward, her face flushed with ugly, desperate fury. "You malicious, pathetic woman!" Eleanor screamed, her voice cracking unpleasantly over the silent crowd. "You can't do this. You're nothing. You are his wife. You owe him." But Eleanor was swiftly, brutally silenced, not by Clara, but by the crowd itself. A low, unified murmur of deep disapproval swept through the room. The city's elite, the investors, the politicians, they were not loyal to Richard. They were loyal only to power. And the absolute, undeniable power in that room belonged solely to the grieving woman in the mourning coat. Several executives near the front physically turned their backs on the stage, shutting Eleanor out entirely. Everywhere else, glowing rectangles illuminated the dim ballroom. Phones were raised high in the air. The cameras that Richard had specifically invited to broadcast his crowning glory were now meticulously, mercilessly recording his absolute ruin. He was dismantled entirely, not by petty revenge, not by a screaming match, but by the cold, surgical application of the truth. Clara stood motionless at the bottom of the stairs, watching the house of cards flatten into nothing. The fallout of a collapsed empire is not a sudden explosion. It is a rapid, humiliating drain. Within 10 minutes of Clara lowering the microphone, the grand ballroom of the Lumina estate was effectively empty. The politicians suddenly remembered urgent engagements. The investors quietly slipped out through the side exits, refusing to make eye contact with the stage. Richard was left standing in a cavernous, glittering room, listening to the hollow echo of his own ruin. Over the next 7 days, the consequences arrived not with malice, but with cold, administrative efficiency. The banks, no longer stalled by the illusion of a bailout, moved in with breathtaking speed. In broad daylight, tow trucks arrived at the corporate valet stands, dragging the imported sports cars away by their axles. The sprawling, minimalist penthouse with the sweeping city views was foreclosed upon. The heavy doors were deadbolt, while Richard's bespoke Italian suits were unceremoniously boxed up by entirely indifferent movers. Vanessa, possessing the survival instinct of shark, didn't wait for the water to drain entirely. The very next morning, she walked into the lobby of Richard's fiercest rival, the developer she had secretly texted during the gala, ready to gracefully pivot and trade her allegiance for a new lifeline. But she vastly underestimated the speed at which scandal travels in high society. The rival developer didn't even offer her a chair. He simply showed her the door. The video of the ballroom had circulated to every phone in the zip code. Everyone knew exactly what she was, a woman who climbed a rotting ladder and brought nothing of value to the table. She found herself completely blacklisted, locked out of the penthouse suites and VIP lounges, left standing on the pavement holding absolutely nothing but her silk dresses and a permanently burned reputation. As for Richard, the sheer velocity of his fall stripped away every ounce of his manufactured bravado. By the 5th day, cornered in a cheap, rendered room that smelled of stale smoke, he finally did what drowning men always do. He picked up his phone and called the very woman he had tried to throw away. When Clara answered, she was sitting at her father's old wooden desk, looking at the finalized deeds of the estate. "Clara, please," Richard begged, his voice trembling broken, stripping away the tycoon to reveal the terrified, hollow man beneath. "I'm sorry. I was blind. We built a life together. 30 years, Clara. You can't just erase 30 years. We can fix this." Clara did not raise her voice. She did not express a single ounce of the grief she had felt on the pavement a week prior. The woman on the line was no longer the wounded wife. She was the architect of his reality. "We didn't build a life. Richard," she said quietly, "you built a stage, and you made me stand in the shadows. You didn't lock a wife out of a party. You locked a grieving woman out of her own life. I'm just changing the locks." She hung up the phone. The following morning, Clara arrived at the Lumina estate. She didn't use the VIP entrance. She walked through the front doors as the sole, uncontested owner. Her first act of business was swift and surgical. She terminated Richard's toxic loyalists. Starting at the top, she stood quietly in the lobby and watched as Eleanor, stripped of her unearned authority and sputtering with impotent rage, was escorted out of the building by the very security guards she had once ruthlessly berated. Clara reclaimed the glass tower not to live in it, but to cleanse it. The illusion was entirely dead, replaced by the cold, satisfying weight of consequence. The story of a woman who reclaims her power should not end at the height of the destruction. It should end in the quiet place where the healing finally begins. A week after the glass doors of the penthouse were locked for good, the city was greeted by a soft, misty morning. Clara drove out to a sprawling, green cemetery on the quiet edge of town. She walked the manicured path alone. Carrying the heavy velvet box she had clutched to her chest on that terrible night, she knelt on the damp earth. There were no flashing cameras here, no desperate crowds, just the wind through the old oak trees. She placed her sister's ashes into the ground, finally laying her to rest with the dignity and profound love she deserved. Clara reached into the deep pocket of her coat and pulled out the tarnished skeleton key. She pressed the cold, heavy brass against the smooth stone of the marker, holding it there for a long moment. She didn't cry. She simply whispered, "I kept the promise. I own the doors." But the most remarkable part of Clara's revenge is what she did next. She did not move into the lavish penthouse. She did not buy imported cars or drape herself in diamonds to prove her worth to a society she fundamentally despised. Instead, she took the towering, arrogant symbol of her husband's vanity, and she dismantled its purpose. The Lumina estate was quietly restructured into the Lumina Foundation. Clara transformed the glittering, hyper-luxury development into a sprawling, fully funded community center and housing initiative. She opened those heavy glass doors to the women the world so casually overlooks. The women working double shifts. The women carrying the invisible weight of their families. The quiet, practical women that foolish men refer to as dusty anchors. Clara gave them a fortress. She gave them the resources, the shelter, and the capital to build their own lives without ever needing to ask a man for a key. If you go looking for Clara today, you will not find her in a corporate boardroom or at a high society gala. You will find her at the edge of the city, kneeling in the rich soil of a sprawling, sunlit garden. She wears a simple, worn linen shirt, the dirt proudly staining her hands. A magnificent Maine Coon cat lounges lazily on a sun-warmed stone nearby, a gentle, quiet companion in a life that finally belongs entirely to her. There is no husband to belittle her. There is no toxic family to mock her. There is only the deep, unbothered peace that comes when you completely remove the noise of cruel people from your world. Clara was never weak. Her gentleness was never a void waiting to be filled by someone else's ego. It was a fortune she held quietly, spending it only on the things that truly mattered. So, as we leave Clara in her garden, carry this truth with you. Never measure a person's strength by the volume of their voice. Never mistake a gentle spirit for a fragile one, or a patient woman for a helpless one. The most powerful people in the world are rarely the loudest in the room. They're the ones quietly holding the master keys, waiting for the exact right moment to turn the lock. If you have ever been the quiet one, the overlooked anchor, or the one they underestimated, let Clara's silence be your battle cry. If this story reminded you of your own hidden strength, please like this video so it can reach another person who desperately needs to hear it today. Share it with someone who is quietly building their own empire in the shadows. And make sure to subscribe to the channel for more stories of profound, undeniable justice. Thank you for watching, and remember, true power doesn't rattle the locks. It owns the doors.